Dark at night, Dad would go up to one of their places and get a 50-pound bag of sugar.
Oh, wow.
And bring it home.
Black market sugar.
Because of flagellation, poisoning the atmosphere, right? Global warming.
One of the most depressing, 11, 12, 13, we took over a lot of the responsibilities from our father.
Hi YouTube friends, I'm Heidi Villegas with Healing Harvest Homestead, and today I have two wonderful men who lived and grew up at the end of the Great Depression and therefore lived into their probably teenage years during that era of time when the effects of the Great Depression were still very evident. So we're going to talk today about some of their experiences during that time period. And this is Ward Gubler, my dad. He's 86 and grew up in southern Utah. And this is my Uncle Dutch. And I don't know how old you are.
I'll be 84 in 2 months.
Okay, 84. And they grew up coming from a pioneer family in southern Utah here in Santa Clara. So we're going to talk about the Great Depression era and what life was like. So, Uncle Dutch, you were talking about chores a minute ago. I want you to pay attention to the difference between chores back then and chores for kids now. This is interesting.
Well, growing up in our family, we had 8 children. There were 3 of us that were older. We were 18 months apart. Ward is the oldest. We had a sister born 18 months later, and then I was born 18 months after that. And so essentially, while we had younger brothers and sisters, during the early years at least, it was up to Ward and Pat, our sister, and myself to do those chores. And we had chores to do around the house and around the farm every day. We had to milk the cow in the morning, milk the cow in the evening. We had to feed the cattle. We had chores, normal chores that you would have around the farm and the ranch all of the time. Ward and I, as we got older, and older meaning 11, 12, 13, we took over a lot of the responsibilities from our father, with orders, of course, but he bought and sold cattle. And so he was gone a lot, and he would leave things for Ward and I to do during the week, and he came back on Friday, and then we usually worked Saturday and Sunday with him to do the things that we couldn't do. And so we did a lot of things. In the summers, we had a truck farm. We raised corn, we raised tomatoes, we raised vegetables.
Had a fruit orchard.
Had a fruit orchard. We raised alfalfa for cattle. And so the summer was spent basically maintaining crops of one kind or another, harvesting the crops of one kind or another. Our father in the summer would be a peddler. What we called Santa Clara was really basically born by people who picked their various crops and then took them out and peddled them in other towns where they did
mining towns.
Mining towns, yeah. And so Dad was he was a excellent peddler. He knew people everywhere, and so.
Hell, Dutch, I became an excellent peddler.
Well, so did I. I mean, that's how I think that peddling with Dad actually gave us the confidence that we need.
Pick a street out and say, go knock on the doors and tell them what we have for sale.
Yeah, and it really does build confidence and character, I guess you might say. So during the summers, that's what we did. I don't know about how Ward feels, but I always felt that we were really picked on in the summer because we rarely had the weekends off. We would be hauling hay while our friends were listening to the baseball games.
I didn't feel like we were picked on. I just felt like that's the way life was. You had to participate in whatever the economic activity was, the farming or the ranching, the cattle we had. Spending nights irrigating alfalfa during the night, worrying about whether I was going to step on a rattlesnake or something, or getting caught in an anthill.
Yeah, or crossing the flooded creek. We had a farm that we called 3 Mile, which was a couple of miles west of Santa Clara, and water was scarce, especially in late summer. And it just so happens in August, generally late July, August, is when the rains came on Pine Valley Mountain. And so our father would be watching Pine Valley Mountain in the afternoons. When it rained up there, it meant that there would be increased water that would come down Santa Clara, what they call the Santa Clara River now, but we called it the Santa Clara Creek at that time. And it would be high water. Everybody had so much water that they could use. If they used more than that, they paid for it. And so when there's extra water came down, what we called high water, then we had to go get it and turn it into the fields and water the fields with free water. And so Ward and I frequently would have to get on an old tractor or a horse or something, go to 3 Mile, cross a flooded creek, and hike up over the hill to the head gate where the ditch came in, and turn the water in, and that's where the rattlesnakes, they would sometimes get in the ditches. And so we did things like that. In the springs, one of our chores was to clean out the barns and the corrals. In those days, we didn't buy full fertilizer. Our father was basically a subsistent farmer. He didn't have any modern equipment. He had 2 strong boys. So Ward and I would go every spring, and with 6-tine pitchforks, we would throw manure into the back of the truck.
2.5 ton truck.
2.5 ton truck, and then we would go to the farm in 3 Mile, and Ward and I would be in the back with our pitchforks, broadcasting the cow manure and the horse manure over the alfalfa fields, and while Dad or one of the smaller guys drove the truck very slowly. So that's how we fertilized the fields. It was all natural.
That's amazing.
We didn't have a manure spreader.
No.
We were the
manure
spreaders.
So basically, you two were the men of the house for a good part of the time when you were pretty young.
Until a couple of younger brothers came along
to help out
some years later.
So let's move into gardening right now, because I know, Dad, when we were little kids, that's actually how you fertilized our garden. Mm-hmm. We didn't use
the horse manure.
We used our horse manure. We had 2 horses, and Dad, every spring, or actually I think it was in the fall in Las Vegas, you'd spread the manure on the garden. And then I remember being little kids, and we'd be planting in the rows in the manure.
The manure was tilled under.
I still found some.
Well, you found it, sure. It was tilled under there.
And it didn't hurt me. It was fine. But yeah, talk about the gardening, and talk about how the family was fed from the garden.
So let me tell you a little bit about the property we grew up on. We grew up on a piece of property that had been part of our grandfather's home on an acre of ground in Santa Clara. And I can remember as a small child, Santa Clara was settled by LDS converts from Switzerland. Mm-hmm. And they were sent to Santa Clara to accomplish a mission. And that mission was to grow grapes to make wine for the church sacrament.
And cotton.
Wow.
And so in Santa Clara, nearly every significant piece of property, in addition to a garden, included a small vineyard. And I can remember the lot, the old house I grew up in Santa Clara, we grew up in, half of that land was a vineyard at one time. Where the basement house was, where Dad ultimately was given permission by his father, our grandfather, to build a home. he and his friend dug a basement, which he did the basement with the idea that eventually he'd build a home. But there was still quite a bit of ground available, even though there were 2 homes on the property, for a big garden. I can remember we had a row of fig trees that probably had maybe 10 fig trees in it. We had walnut trees, 2 or 3 huge walnut trees. Down at the bottom of the property was a pig pen and a big chicken run.
This is all on an acre.
All on an acre.
Yeah.
An acre is a pretty good piece of property when you lay it out.
You can homestead on an acre.
And so we grew up gardening, growing tomatoes, growing corn. I can remember looking forward to planting the peas. We had 2 apricot trees in the backyard. That when we were kids, we loved getting up in the apricot tree and eating the green apricots that are
Had pecans, black walnut trees, and every summer, Ma would can all of the food that we needed for the winter. So she canned corn, she canned tomatoes, she canned
and this was
green beans
in a pressure cooker.
Okay, so she did have a pressure cooker.
She had a pressure cooker,
okay.
And what she couldn't do with a water bath type of canning, which you do with fruit, she would have to use the pressure cooker for beans and that sort of thing. We didn't have a freezer. No such thing as a freezer back then.
Okay.
We had a cellar.
We had a cellar, and Dad had Grandpa. We ended up living in the house that our grandfather built in the 1870s, 1880s, and this cellar the house had I thought it was a huge house when I was a little kid. Turns out it was a pretty hard small house.
I thought it was a huge house too.
but underneath that house was a huge cellar that was lined on one whole wall of shelves, and Mom would have all of those shelves by the end of summer filled with all kinds of fruits and vegetables and venison. She would pressure cook venison
and beef,
and then it would be bottled because, again, you didn't have a freezer. Ultimately, as a kid, I remember they did rent a freezer locker in one of the markets in St. George that they could put food in. But I can remember Dad, in the fall of the year, we would always butcher 1 pig. We always had a pig and a steer and usually a lamb. Dad liked mutton. I never cared for mutton. You know, they didn't call it lamb then, it was mutton.
Yeah, it was old ewe.
Old ewe. And so the pig, he would cure. He would make salt, bacon, the sides of the pork, different pork. And then some bins in that cellar, we had sawdust and burlap and stuff that he'd wrap these pieces of meat in, and that's where the pork would be. Now, those bins had been used by Grandpa as ice bins years before, because his homestead on the Diamond Valley, Pine Valley mountain area, he had a pond, and he would cut ice, and they would haul the ice to Santa Clara and wrap it in sawdust again and cover it up, and it would last pretty much through the summer.
Wow.
And they'd use it to make ice cream in the summertime. Wow. So it's all kind of self-sufficiency.
So when we picked peaches, Herman, Dad, and I would pick, and Ma and Pat and Toodle would pack the peaches, and then we kept the ripe ones for Ma to bottle.
Okay.
On corn days, Herm and I picked the corn and shucked it. Pat and Ma primarily, but sometimes Toodle
and Doris.
I call Doris Toodle. That was her nickname. They'd cut the corn off the cob and then blanch it and then then bottle it. And so it was a sort of an assembly line type of thing. Every crop that we put up.
That's so interesting. So how much?
And one other thing is,
Yeah.
Ma would take the lard from the butchers and make soap out of it.
Okay.
Made lye soap out of it. She had this
She
big
would render
tub.
it first, and then use the renderings to make soap, lye soap.
Yeah, making your own soap.
And she made
That's
her
one
own
of my
soap.
favorite things.
And she would
Oh,
shave
yes.
it with a knife to use for laundry and that sort of thing. And her laundry was a washer outside the house. And I remember,
With the old washboard.
well, it started out with a washboard, but then she had a washer with a ringer.
Ringer.
I remember getting my thumb caught in the ringer once.
Oh,
And I jumped right up into the washer to try to finally pull my hand out of that ringer. But
In
quite
the
a few
old-
kids got injured badly
I
with those
bet.
ringers.
In the old days, Grandpa had a well just out in back of the house, and that's where the culinary
Had a
water came
pump.
from. But
Had a water pump. I
Yeah.
can remember it working.
then
manual pump.
by the time we were kids, Santa Clara had its own water system. They pulled water from Snows Canyon Spring to Santa Clara, and had a big head house up on the hill that fed the whole town.
That's really. Can I ask
The
you-
lot water came from the water for the gardens was all lot water.
Was it?
It was flood irrigation.
Came out of the Santa
okay.
Clara Creek.
So we had ditches that run miles that to get the water into town, and every farmer or every resident had so many hours of water, depending on. I'm not sure how I guess they purchased it, but one of Ward and my chores in the spring, another one of the chores we had in the spring is digging ditch.
Cleaning ditch.
Cleaning ditch. You either had to pay money for your water fees, or you could work it off.
And of course,
Cleaning
Dad,
the ditches.
Dad had
Wow.
2 boys that he could put out on those ditch cleaning crews.
And the ditches, understand, were not concrete at that time. They were all.
They were dirt.
Mud, yeah. Real quick question. So how much, if you could put a percentage on the amount of food that you were able to grow or hunt or raise in terms of beef and lamb and pig, like what percentage came from your farm or came from your efforts?
I would guess that if you discounted sugar and of course to make your own bread, and Mom made bread every week. We look forward. She'd make 7 or 8 loaves of bread
Okay.
for the week, and we'd go through a loaf of bread a day probably. And so we always look forward to the day she made bread, because you could smell that bread cooking. And initially, the stove we had that we grew up with was a wood stove, wood burning stove that she would have to stoke and keep hot and get the oven temperature up to a certain level, and then keep it there by adjusting the wood, the flow of air into the stove.
Is that
To
the
keep the
stove I
temperature.
remember in the old house? Is that
No.
the same stove?
The stove that you can remember is now in the museum in Santa Clara.
Oh, okay.
And it was Mom's wooden stove that she had in the basement. But when we moved into the big house that Grandpa had, I call it a big house. It really wasn't a big house. Anyway, it had a great big black iron wood stove with a water tank in the corner. Didn't have the water tank on the side of the stove the way some did. Grandpa had rigged up a water tank, a pretty good sized one, and then run pipes through the stove, and that's the way the water was heated, went to that tank, and then turn the water on in the tap, and you'd have warm water.
Oh, that's how you got your hot water.
That's how we got the hot water.
Nice.
That's where
By
we had
burning
it.
wood in the wood stove.
We also had that in the basement too.
Yeah, the basement, she had a wood stove in the basement.
And
And that wood
water.
stove is the one that's in the museum. That's the wood stove that I had for quite a while.
Yeah, I remember.
Let
that.
me just add in here, just chip in. The reason Ward calls it the big house is at that time, before we moved into that house in probably 1942, we lived in the basement. And the basement had one,
Kitchen?
two, three rooms. A kitchen, the front room or living room, and 1 bedroom and a bathroom. And so there were 3 of us kids in there, plus Mom and Dad.
Wow.
And so when we moved into the big house, it was a real treat because Herm and I had our own bedroom upstairs, you know.
Upstairs in the wintertime, cold as the devil. We had no heat upstairs.
I remember that.
And there was no cooling.
In the summer it was
blistering hot, but it was still,
it was a big house.
It was still a lot of improvement over the basement.
But this is one thing, you know, that brings up a point. People adapt. Herm and
we thought we lived a great life.
We worked in temperatures of 105, 110. It didn't matter what the temperature was. We were doing our work. And we didn't die. We didn't faint or anything. We basically, people are so afraid of global warming, you know, and if they don't have an air conditioner, cars didn't have air conditioning. So
this big house, I call it the big house, Grandpa's house, didn't have any heating. It had a fireplace. It had 4 fireplaces, 2 upstairs and 2 downstairs, all hooked to the same chimney. He built the house himself. It was adobe, mud.
But the point I wanted to make on that is that we adapt. Yes. People can adapt to adverse conditions and can do quite well.
The
problem we have right now is a population that are so spoiled by all the conveniences that we have. Yeah. Is they're inconvenient if they have to go out and there's no air conditioning or get in the car.
And we have a freebie mentality in this country that kids have adopted. They don't have chores to do. It's unfortunate. They're all urban. Most of the kids today grow up in urban areas. The kids that are really fortunate grow up in rural areas where they get to experience participating in the farming, the chores, raising animals.
This is very true. I just want to make a point too, that even like for families who are interested in learning these old skills, which I think is valuable and a necessary thing to do just in case something happens, but you can do that even if you're living in a city. Certain things. You can can food, you can bake bread.
Well, and some people in urban areas do that with community gardens.
Right.
And so you find more and more of that going on.
It's difficult.
In urban areas, it's very difficult.
And you have to work as a community.
And it's a very small percentage of the population that participates in that kind of activity.
To grow enough food to survive on, the survivors, you can still do it today, but very few people know how.
Exactly.
And it's very difficult for anyone in urban areas because there's just not enough space. They have these shared plots that they grow a few tomatoes and whatever, and it's just to eat peace on during the summer.
It is. That's all it is.
But I'll tell you what, Heidi, and I think this is where your website probably is really valuable. We're coming to a time that probably it's going to get to us a lot faster than we think, when the 747s are going to stop flying all of those fruits and vegetables in from all over the world.
Yeah.
We go into a grocery store today and we've got everything you can imagine from all over the world.
Yeah.
And it's fresh, reasonably fresh, and sometimes expensive, but it's there. We're going into a period of deglobalization where that's going to become more and more difficult. It's going to become more and more expensive, and a lot of people are not going to be able to afford to
basic
participate
vegetables.
in it. Yeah.
That's true. And hence all the lab-created food right now they're trying to get going, which is very scary.
Yeah. Well, actually, it's how we're going to feed 10 million people, 10 billion people. You laugh, but...
I'm not laughing because I don't believe you, or it's not laughing in disbelief. It's laughing, I don't know, kind of because I know, I agree with you.
Well, we'll probably be doing as the World Economic Forum wants us to, eating insects.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, people eat insects all over the world, and we just don't do it here.
No.
And they're not bad if they're cooked properly. I've eaten a lot of them.
This is true. So, I just want to see if you guys can maybe give me an estimate on that other question, though. Like, how much food do you think you supplied for your family on your acre, and from the cattle and everything?
Well, I'll take a guess, Herman, then you can correct me, but I would say at least 75%.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and Dad, you mentioned you
I
bought sugar.
started to get in on that topic, but you look at what was purchased you talk about the Great Depression, and then the rationing that took place after the World War II started, after we got into World War II. We didn't get into the war until, nearly 3 years or so after the war started in Europe. Mm-hmm. And then the rationing hit, but I can remember that sugar was not available. Flour was purchased in bags that were colorful linen type bags that most women who had access to them saved the cloth to make dresses for their kids.
The flour sack.
The flour sack dresses.
Yeah.
That took place routinely. But sugar was available pretty much only on the black market.
Wow.
And because otherwise, to can, you had to use honey in lieu of sugar. So I can remember in the summertime when Mom was canning, and there were a couple of guys in Santa Clara that were in the black market. In the dark of night, Dad would go up to one of their places and get a 50-pound bag of sugar.
Oh, wow.
And bring it home, and
Black
that was
market
what
sugar.
Mom used to can with then. Because we didn't have access to the bees, honeybees.
Right.
Tires were rationed.
Few people in the area
Gasoline
got
was
very-
rationed. You couldn't get gasoline to speak of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you talked about growing up in the Depression. Dutch is a little younger than I am, but I remember being born in 1936, tail end of the Depression. We didn't realize as kids that we were in a depression, but I heard the stories told by my father about ranchers and people who owned pigs having to kill them because there was no market for them. Same with cattle, because there was no market for them.
Is this kind of what happened with the farmers a few years ago, where they were destroying crops?
Well, they were destroying crops and dumping milk.
Yeah.
You get an oversupply of something and people don't have the money to pay the price.
And
that's what happened.
killing animals. I mean, look at what we did to the chicken population because of bird flu.
Yeah,
Look at what we did to the beef population because of BSE.
Yeah.
And
See,
that
and
same thing happened in
then
1929 with the
Right.
cattle. The virus was introduced in the United States that was very detrimental to cattle. The only way to control it was to depopulate the cattle. And
now we have a very misguided segment of the population, the green group, that feels like they want to get rid of all cattle because of flagellation poisoning the atmosphere, right? Global warming, what crap.
one of the most depressing things that our father experienced in his life was he had to drive a lot of their cattle up into a canyon there in Diamond Valley and shoot them.
Oh, no.
They shot him and killed them all.
Even though people were starving.
Well, people were. This was before the Depression, or I guess it was right during the early part of the Depression, 1929.
That's crazy.
But still, it was a mandate by the government to control foot and mouth disease virus.
Wow.
We talked about the role of government in trying to help solve some of the economic problems. Government getting involved in solving economic problems is a disaster. Always has been, always will be. Even Franklin Delano Roosevelt's, I think, Secretary of the Treasury, can't remember who his name was, but it's in the history books, you can find it, made the statement toward the end of the Great Depression that we spent all this money on all of these federal programs and we haven't done a damn thing to solve the problem.
Yeah.
It was the war that solved the problem.
war solved the problem. The war is what brought an end to the Depression, World War II.
But back to our situation. We lived Herman and I's youth during the late 40s and the 50s was during a time when people like our father basically were subsistent farmers, and very few of them had modern equipment. Everything was done by hand.
Yes.
Everything was done by hand.
There aren't a lot of people around, Heidi, that could say, I harnessed a horse, hooked it to a hay wagon or a dump rake, and raked the hay field, dumping it, and then go back through with a pitchfork making shocks of pile for hay so that we could load it on the truck.
And load it on loose, yeah.
Wow.
Herm and I became very expert in loading loose hay on a truck. We could stack it probably 10, 12 feet high. We had one of our younger brothers up there tramping, stomping the hay down so that it, and then we hauled it back to the barn and we unloaded it the same way by pitchfork.
Wow.
Stacked it in the barn.
And now people have fancy hay bales.
Yeah, we always were, when hay balers became available, at least I was always envious of those people that had them.
Yeah, I was too. And in fact, I asked Dad a time or two why he didn't get somebody to bale the hay.
What did he say?
Well, it's easier to do it this way. He had two boys.
Well, it was also a matter of finances. He had two boys that could do it, but available money, and the other thing that was different in those days, credit for people like the farmers like Dad was hard to come by. And mostly if they had to borrow money, they would go to a local rich guy, a guy that got rich on the black market during the war or whatever, and borrow from them. That's how Bobby and I bought our first car and trailer. We didn't go to a bank, and we went to a local Merv River.
Yeah, I was just thinking of him. He was one of the black market people.
Wow. Now, did they kind of operate like loan sharks? Or were they kind?
Well, no, they were good.
They were okay. They treated the people, I think, well. Yeah. And in Santa Clara, it wasn't Merv River, it was Warren River.
Yeah. And Harvey Stuckey.
And Harvey Stuckey.
Oh my goodness! Wow.
Yeah. So the other thing that we did, Heidi, that you would appreciate this is now you go out and BLM lands and along the highways and you see these beautiful fences. Herm actually has them here too, all these iron posts. In those days, all fence posts were cedar posts.
Yeah.
And there's still a lot of them are.
But so Herm and I spent a lot of time, well, not a lot of time, but good share of time cutting cedar posts. And Dad would hire an Indian fellow by the name of Tony Yellowjacket. And he was probably in his 40s or so. And Herm and I were young kids. And
shortly after daylight, he'd drop us off with our lunch bags and our axes and files to sharpen the axes. He'd drop us off on the Panaca Summit.
Really?
About 80 miles north of St. George.
Spent the day cutting posts.
Wow.
I remember one trip out, Dutch and I would try to keep up with Tony, the Indian guy that Dad had out there cutting cedar posts. And it was kind of a contest. And you'd cut cedar posts until time for lunch. And I think, if I remember the numbers approximately, Tony had nearly 90 posts. I had around 80. Dutch had around 70.
I'm not sure I had that many.
No, you did. And, that was a lot of cedar posts. When Dad came back in the evening for us to load the cedar posts, there was a lot of cedar posts on that truck.
But he was...
but our hands, I don't know about your hands, Dutch, but my hands to grip the axe, to ungrip the axe, I had to do this.
Oh, man.
And then when we got ready to go back and start cutting again, had to put the axe handle in and take my fingers and wrap them around the axe handle.
The other thing we did, Heidi, that you'll appreciate is we, in the upper lot, we had an upper lot as well. And in later years, that's where we had a big
barn right there that you painted. Mm-hmm. That was Grandpa Gubler's barn that he built and then tore down.
Okay.
It was in the upper lot
Okay.
that you're talking about.
So we had tomato patches, and we raised tomatoes down below, but most of them were up there. So it was actually a fairly big patch. And nowadays they have these fancy things that they put over a tomato plant and they grow up, and you don't need to. In those days, you had to tie them.
We tied them.
Yeah.
So you had to stake them and tie them.
I still tie mine.
And so we had
I do too.
we cut our own stakes, but we didn't go by twine. Dad, in the old days, I guess all of the old pioneers used yucca. You know the plant yucca?
The agave plant.
And you put that into water and you can string it.
Yeah.
And you get about a 12-inch string, and that's what we used for tomato ties.
Wow. Now, when it dried, did it shrink a little bit?
Not enough to make any difference.
Okay. Wow.
Because you don't tie them that tight anyway around the stake.
That's really interesting. I know it's.
But that you avoided spending money any way you could.
Well, and you used what you had available to you.
You used resources available.
Yeah.
It gets back to your survival thing, surviving by doing the things that you need to do to actually survive.
Right.
And there aren't a whole lot of people around, unless you grew up on a farm or in a rural environment, who could say, okay, I need to butcher a beef. I know how to butcher a beef.
Right.
Because we have butchered a lot of deer that we've killed.
Right.
When you're hunting them and you're field dressing them.
Yeah.
Same process.
It is. And it's a good process to know.
And I can remember when we were kids, too young to help, but we'd be hanging around when the steer was being butchered or when the pig was being slaughtered and skinned or dehaired. We didn't skin them.
Right.
They'd hoist them up, build a big fire, fill a big 50-gallon drum with hot water, and they'd hoist the pig up and drop it down in that 50-gallon drum of water, and you'd pull it out and lay it on a slanted rack, and with knives you'd skin the hair off of the pig.
Take the hair off, And actually...
and then when that pig was butchered, we'd make a football out of the bladder, blow it up, and
so you really did that, huh?
Yeah, we did.
At one point,
and we also ate mountain oysters up at the ranch.
Did you?
Absolutely.
At one point, when we were not too young, I remember this clearly. Dad hooked up with a guy by the name of Fred Rose. Mm-hmm. Not sure where he came from or where he went, but they went into the butchering business, and they this is at the Krell, in all the shit and everything else there. That's where we butchered the cattle, and they would shoot it in the head with a .22 and knock it down, and then slit its throat, and with a block and tackle that we used for the pig as well, hoist it up and let it bleed out. They'd skin it. And then Dad would actually sell, without USDA approval, he would
sell raw beef to the Indians.
Quarters and, halves of beef to people. And
I can remember we went to the Shibwoods Indian Reservation once when I was a kid, when I was a little kid. And I got in the back of the pickup, and Dad had the beef laying in the back of the pickup, covered up, and one of the Indian guys came up and pulled out his knife. He always wore a knife. Most of them did.
Yeah.
Cut off a piece of beef and ate it. Said, good beef.
Okay.
Good beef.
Wow. So
a lot of things like that. If we keep thinking, we can think of a lot of them, but that gives you a good idea.
Yeah, it's really fascinating because it sounds like not only were you self-sufficient and able to take care of yourselves and the family, and everybody worked, but you were also entrepreneurial on top of it, and were able to sell and market to the community and earn money at the same time.
Well, we learned to, you grew up partially this way, because in Las Vegas I had a big garden.
Yeah.
And raised cucumbers, made pickles, and
Yeah.
and did jams and that sort of thing. And I still do that.
Well, Dad, that's where I learned it from.
Yeah, Ward is the only one in the family.
I made you.
Still
Can I
does
call
it.
you back shortly?
You know, I moved away and was gone
Okay,
for
be right
55 years. And
Yeah.
Huh?
So there, you know, everything was available.
Oh, it won't be that long. Okay.
Yeah, and you kind of, I guess,
Love you, bye.
I know if you don't practice the skills and teach your kids, it kind of gets lost.
See, all the grandkids love my pickles.
Yeah, well, they're good. And your tomato juice is the best in the world.
And
you know.
guess what? Now my pickles are good.
Are they?
They make it the same
And my
way.
tomato juice is good. No, I wanted to just ask one more question about this, and this is about clothes, because Dad, I remember one time you were telling me about shoes, and you had one pair of shoes, and you'd wear them to church, and pretty much the rest of the time you were barefoot.
Well,
Was everybody like that?
we went barefoot, but I was one of those kids growing up that I didn't like to go barefoot. My feet were too damn tender to go barefoot. But we did go barefoot a lot in the summertime.
Yeah, but we didn't have extra shoes. Though. That's
No,
true. We had
usually one pair of dress shoes that we'd used to wear to school. We didn't have tenny runners then. We didn't use gym shoes like they do now. And a pair of work boots, the work shoes. That's what we wore. The work shoes were pretty well worn out most of the time.
Yeah.
How about the sisters? Did they wear shoes?
They same way. They didn't have a lot of shoes. Didn't have a lot of clothes.
Yeah.
And wearing clothes. When I came home from school, I went upstairs and I changed clothes into my what I call today grubby clothes. And that's what we wore to play in and do the chores and that sort of thing.
And we wore Levi's
so
and
we
just a sport
changed,
shirt.
we changed clothes every day.
Yeah.
You didn't?
And the girls wore a
fancy.
skirt, and you know that's the '50s, so they had knee-high socks. And,
The 50s turned out to be a pretty good decade for Dad.
Yeah.
He did really well.
I think the country was doing better economically.
The country came out of World War II, and from that point on, things got economically better and better. Yeah. So that was a pretty good decade through the 50s, late 40s.
Can I ask another question?
Yeah.
About herbal medicine,
Yeah.
since that's what people mostly learn from me these days. But when you guys got sick, what did Grandma do? I don't think you just went off to the doctor.
We didn't go to the doctor.
We never went to the doctor.
Very seldom if ever went to the doctor. It was Vicks and mustard
plasters and you know, cooling down.
Mom didn't have a lot of knowledge about herbal type medicines like you're doing now, which you do.
Yeah, it kind of got lost.
People got lost
with the AMA in the 1940s.
See, what you're doing is you're reviving some long lost practices of indigenous peoples and others who understood the value of native plants for medicinal reasons.
All
the only medicinal plant I can remember was Brigham tea.
Yeah, it's a very good medicinal.
Brigham tea, I can remember more than one occasion drinking Brigham tea. I don't know about you, Doug.
Yeah, no, Brigham tea it still is.
Or what people sometimes call desert tea.
Yeah.
Sometimes they call it that.
But basically,
we're not a lot of medicines.
We basically survived just like the old folks.
I can remember once when I was about 6 years old, getting an earache in my left ear. I still have loss of hearing in that ear. And my ear ached 24/7 for a full week. And there wasn't anything that anyone could do. I mean, Mom, I just had to get over it. But I had an infection in my ear, and it caused me partial hearing loss in my left ear. Not enough to keep me out of the Army or anything like that.
Right. Well, the body has amazing healing powers.
What I can remember is we didn't run to the doctor.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there weren't very many doctors either. There was A.W. and
Reichman and
Fleischman. He was. Although when I fell off the slide and broke my neck, Ma took me to AW.
You went
Well,
to
but
I didn't.
neck and
I
you just went
didn't
to
stay in the
doctor?
hospital. Yeah.
Oh my goodness, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Wow. Were
No,
in a
if
neck
you
brace at
injured
least?
yourself, normally they would require you to go to the doctor, and we didn't go to the doctor. And
Yeah.
tetanus shots, hell, I can't remember how many nails I ran through my shoes into my foot. No tetanus
No
shots.
tetanus shots.
Yeah. Well, there wasn't very much in the way of immunization those
No.
days.
No.
Matter of fact, we didn't, we were little kids when I think the diphtheria, what were these three shots?
DPT.
Measles, diphtheria.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
hell,
Mumps.
we all had measles. I had mumps once.
When chickenpox started or
All
mumps
had
started,
chicken pox.
the women would take their kids around and expose them.
Exactly. Let them get it so
Yeah.
they don't get it later.
And the rationale was
Yeah.
just like today, that's not practiced, in fact, but children generally experience a much milder illness with all of these viruses
Yeah.
than adults.
I can remember that some
Yeah.
homes were quarantined, and they'd actually come put a quarantine sign up on the house, warning people away if there was a bad disease of some kind
Wow.
going on.
And I just want to point out here too, because Uncle Dutch, you're a medical doctor, right? Or you have a degree, a medical
Yeah, sort of
degree.
a quasi-medical doctor, but
Okay.
yeah, tropical medicine and viral diseases.
Yeah, Uncle Dutch is aware of all of the, you mentioned the indigenous medicine and
Yeah,
And,
you get out of this country, and of course the Native Americans had a lot of indigenous medicines that basically have been forgotten or certainly not used. You go to a place like China and to India, they still have a very strong practice of traditional medicine. In fact, there are physicians who specialize in it.
Ayurveda and
when I was in
Yeah.
Calcutta, I actually developed a collaborative project with a guy to look at indigenous medicines. But I was with Johns Hopkins at that time, and my budget was pretty small, as this was in the late 60s, and so we didn't have a lot of money to do research. So he had promised me that he could finance this if I gave him the technical support. Turns out he couldn't get the money to finance it from the Indian
that would've been
government.
a
So the
good
collaboration
project.
didn't go anywhere. But the point is that we were going to get traditional medicines from Nagaland up in the border of Assam and Burma, in that area, and those indigenous peoples have all kinds of traditional medicines.
Yeah.
Some of them are very effective, and so we were going to extract the principal chemical in those, try and find the principal chemical so that we could produce the medicines.
needed.
So anyway, it's a
That's
big,
interesting. That's
very
a
important field.
topic. Yeah, it is. All right. So unless you guys can think of anything else about self-sufficiency and self-reliance during that time when you grew up?
Well, my advice is to people, learn some of the skills that it takes to become as self-sufficient as you can become, because
Yeah.
you never know down the road when you might have to use it.
That's right.
For example, if this country ever gets hit with an EMP, guess what's going to happen?
Yeah,
The people who do predictions predict as high as a 90% fatality rate within 3 months.
yeah. And it's
My
because
advice
people don't know how to do things.
My advice is a little different. I agree that it would be nice to learn some survival skills, but I know human nature, and no one is going to do that. They're totally spoiled. Everything is
Some
prepared
people
for them.
will do it.
Some might, but very few. What I would recommend for people, and especially their kids, is to somehow teach those kids to develop an ability to deal with crisis, to deal with adverse conditions.
Become resilient.
Right now we have a society where the slightest little thing upsets them and they can't deal with it. People that can deal with crises, with hard times, they're more adaptable and they can deal with
that's why they need to go back and learn some of the foundational basic skills of survival in society.
Well, that's true, but 90% of the population, you get in this, we're talking about this country, you get outside this country, there are a lot of people that have those skills.
They'll do it. But in this country, particularly people who live in urban areas, who don't know a chicken from a crow, they're in trouble.
Yeah. Luckily, the homesteading movement is actually growing and spreading. There are people.
That's good.
More and more people like me are trying to get people motivated to learn these things.
Teach your kids resilience.
Yeah, resilience is a big deal. Well, gosh. So we talked about your chores, how you were the young, very young men of the house when Grandpa was gone, and then after when he got sick too. I know you both helped. There was the gardening and using manure as fertilizer. We call it at our house. We call the manure gold. It's our liquid
green gold.
Yeah, it's green gold. Yeah.
Great. Another piece of the product, alfalfa, is green gold.
It is. It's a legume. And
I would just add, Heidi, that I'm not sure that Dad knew that he was doing it when he was doing it, but he had a lot of confidence in Herm and I. He would assign us to give us a lot of responsibility.
Taught us how
that kind of trust by him and that kind of responsibility, at least in my mind, I suspect it's true for Herm as well, gave me the self-confidence to make decisions, to be able to do things and not question my ability to do it.
And one of the things
most people don't have that confidence anymore.
One of the things we might mention is that the girls in the family pretty much learned a lot of the same skills. I think they all learned how to make bread. They all learned basic skills of canning and so forth. Sewing. Yeah. So, that's been one of the unfortunate things about American education is that skills training that are acquired through family home economics courses, vocational courses, teach kids rudimentary skills that they keep all their lives. How to handle tools, what tool does what kind of work for you.
Knowledge
and
is
they're
power.
not, and the schools have dropped a lot of those programs, unfortunately. There are some, and I was one as a vocational director of a large school district, who pushed hard to bring those courses, to keep them from disappearing, and bring them back to make them more part of the curriculum in high schools.
And I think that's such a service too in education, because the kids that don't have those skills, and then they get out into the workforce, they can't work.
Well, they can't even make minor simple repairs around their own home.
Right.
If they have a home.
And I think that's what Uncle Dutch and both of you are talking about with the resilience and the adaptability and knowing how to do some simple things.
Yeah, we've developed a society that has become totally dependent on government. Government to provide.
And the big systems.
Well, it's very good, Heidi.
Yeah, thank you for talking with me.
We should have had Bobby sitting here too. She and Judy, they learned how to do Bobby had a lot of the same experiences growing up.
We should have.
You should actually interview. See, Judy, when I talk about some of these things, she says, well, the way I grew up, I would have seen you as a rich kid.
Oh, wow.
Because she said, I grew up, well, no, she grew up in a home that had no running water, and the bathroom was an outhouse. We had an outhouse on our property in Santa Clara, but we didn't use it anymore. But she did. So she grew up in some conditions.
This is my stepmother we're talking about.
Yes, she grew up in some conditions that I couldn't have even imagined as a kid.
I think maybe I should do a talk with the ladies.
You should. You should. Because they have the same kinds of stories to tell.
Well, thank you.